Have you ever met someone whose mere presence unsettled you, even before they said a single word? Not because they were aggressive or arrogant, but because their gaze was different, as if they could see more than they should, as if their words, when they finally spoke, were less of a casual conversation and more of an invitation into the abyss. There's nothing in their appearance that gives them away. No grand gestures, no flamboyant phrases, no attempts to impress. And yet, something about them disturbs you, unsettles you, makes you uncomfortable. Because they're not here to entertain or to fit in. They're here to be. And that, in a time when we all act like characters in a poorly rehearsed play, is deeply unsettling. Can intelligence, when it's genuine, provoke fear? Can a truly lucid man, someone who has descended into his own hell and returned with his eyes even wider open, become a figure people fear, avoid, or reject, not for what he says, but for what he represents? Søren Kierkegaard, the melancholic Dane who lived between despair and faith, would have said yes. But his answer wouldn't be trivial. It wouldn't be about intellectual superiority or emotional power games. The fear that a deeply conscious man provokes, according to Kierkegaard, doesn't stem from his knowledge, but from his truth. Because a human being who has passed through despair and chosen to live authentically does not need. And when someone doesn't need, they can't be bought, seduced, or manipulated. And that, though we don't say it out loud, is terrifying. We live in a society where much of human connection is built on need. I need you to love me, I need you to validate me, I need you to save me from the emptiness I don't know how to face. But when you encounter someone who no longer seeks to be saved by another, who has made peace with the void, who has learned to dance with their own darkness, you realize, sometimes too late, that you are exposed, that you can't hide, because they don't either. And the silence that forms between you isn't comfortable. It's a mirror. Kierkegaard didn't write about toxic relationships or emotional compatibility. He wrote about the self. That self we're all afraid to meet, the one that screams from the depths of the soul when we shut off the noise of the world. A man who has faced his despair, the real kind, the one born from the awareness of not being who he ought to be, becomes strange to others. Because he no longer plays. He no longer seduces. He no longer pretends. This kind of intelligence, existential, not academic, is what Kierkegaard believed cuts through all the superficial layers of life. It's the kind that isn't satisfied with the aesthetics of everyday life. The forced smile, the well-timed joke, the interesting man persona so many rehearse in front of the mirror. This man doesn't need to rehearse because he has already died many times within himself. And with each death, he has let a mask fall away. What's curious is that this man doesn't want to be feared. He doesn't even seek to be understood. He simply wants to be. But precisely because he has become someone who acts not out of lack, but out of truth, he becomes a radical mirror to those still trapped in self-deception. And that's where the fear appears. Because there is nothing more threatening to a false identity than the presence of a true one. Imagine, for a moment, a woman who grew up learning that she must be desired to be valuable. That her presence must be charming, her voice sweet, her pain concealed, and her soul restrained. Now imagine she meets a man who isn't dazzled by beauty, who doesn't need to be entertained, who doesn't play the conventional courting game. A man who, instead of responding to her practiced smiles, remains silent. Who, instead of giving compliments, asks questions. Not trivial ones, but the kind that goes straight to where it hurts. Who are you when no one's watching? What are you hiding behind that laugh? Who are you trying to convince that you're okay? It's no surprise that this kind of man can be frightening, because he's not interested in the mask. He's looking behind it. And not everyone is ready to be seen like that. Not everyone wants to be. Not everyone can be. Kierkegaard wrote that most people live an unconscious life, trapped in immediacy, aesthetics, and pleasure. Only a few, painfully few, reach the ethical stage where they take responsibility for being who they are, even if it brings anguish. And even fewer reach the religious stage, where they surrender to something greater than their ego, in an act of faith without guarantees. The man who has passed through these stages doesn't seek love to complete himself. He seeks it as an extension of his already whole being. Not to be saved, but to share the journey. But for someone still stuck in the first stage, encountering this kind of soul is unbearable. There are no footholds, no easy promises, no way to manipulate him without him noticing. And so he is feared, not because he harms, but because he demands presence. because his very existence calls the other to wake up. And waking up, as Kierkegaard knew well, always hurts. So it's not that Kierkegaardian men, intelligent men in this existential sense, scare women because they're smarter, or more cultured, or more intense. It's that their way of being in the world does not allow others to remain asleep. It doesn't tolerate the superficial relationship, the emotional theater, the unspoken agreement to not see each other. And that's not something everyone is willing to face. This fear is not a flaw. It's a signal that the relationship isn't a masquerade, but a confrontation with the truth. And truth, when we haven't chosen it yet, feels dangerous. Maybe that's why, so often when a woman says, "He was too intense, too deep, too serious," what she's really saying is, "I saw myself reflected in him, and I didn't like what I saw." Or maybe she didn't even get to say it. She just felt the urge to run, and didn't know why. The answer, maybe, was in his gaze. Not because it was intimidating, but because it didn't lie. And in a world full of eyes that look away, that feels like a threat, there is a depth that cannot be faked. And that is the territory where men dwell who have seen too much, felt too much, who have been forged not by comfort, but by solitude, doubt, and surrender. They are not library scholars or charmers with elegant phrases. They are men who have been thrown into the desert of the soul and there, without witnesses, have learned to listen to themselves. They don't expect applause, because their path hasn't been shaped by the world's expectations, but by an inner necessity that drives them to live with integrity, even when it hurts. This kind of man, whom Kierkegaard might have called a singular individual, has chosen the difficult path, to become someone transparent to himself. He doesn't chase social success, or love as anesthesia, or company as distraction. He seeks authenticity, clarity, and that kind of search comes at a cost, the discomfort of others. Because if there's one thing this man cannot, nor wants to do, it's lie. Not because he lacks cunning, but because he understands that every lie, no matter how small, is a betrayal of the soul. And how can you build a relationship with someone who refuses to be deceived, who won't let you hide behind your carefully edited version of yourself? A woman who has grown up in a world that rewards image over substance, who has learned to receive love in exchange for being pleasing, may feel completely disarmed in the face of a gaze that doesn't demand perfection, but truth. Because with him, being beautiful, witty, or charming isn't enough. With him, you must be. You must dare to show yourself unscripted, unmasked, undefended. And that's not just difficult, it's terrifying. Kierkegaard spoke of anguish as the vertigo of freedom, the awareness that we can be anything, but also the burden of having to choose who we will be. An intelligent man in this sense isn't someone who knows everything, but someone who has chosen to face that vertigo. And his mere presence, without saying a word, reminds others that they too could choose, they too could look inward. But they don't want to. Not yet. So, the one who dared becomes the strange one, the uncomfortable one, the intense one. What does a man like this do when he is rejected not for what he did, but for who he is? Usually, nothing. He doesn't beg, doesn't defend himself, doesn't try to convince you, because he knows that true connection cannot be forced. And because he has learned, perhaps painfully, that solitude is not the enemy, but the price of clarity. His lack of need allows him to withdraw with dignity, even with gratitude, because he's not seeking company at any cost, but mutual presence, soul-level reciprocity. And if that's not there, he chooses silence. In a world where so many play the seduction game just to avoid self-reflection, this man offers the opposite, the risk of being seen as you truly are. And that doesn't spark immediate desire, it sparks resistance. Because he's not attractive in the conventional sense, he doesn't promise a life of entertainment or a love without conflict. If anything, he promises truth. And in times of appearances, truth is poison to the soul that has not yet awakened. There are women, not all of course, who have grown accustomed to being seen as muses, trophies, rewards. Women who, from wounds or habit, have learned that being desired feels safer than being known. For them, this man comes with no manual. He doesn't follow the rules. He's not trying to save them or chase them. He just looks at them. But he really looks. And that can be an invitation to awakening or a reason to run. The running isn't always obvious. Sometimes it's disguised as disinterest, as excuses, as, "It's not you, it's me." But deep down, the reason is often the same: fear. Not fear of him, but of what he stirs. Because being close to someone who has made peace with his own darkness forces you, in some way, to look at your own. And some are not ready for that. Not because they can't, but because they sense correctly that once you see, you can't unsee. Kierkegaard knew that human beings often prefer a comfortable lie to an authentic, but difficult, truth. And in that choice, often unconscious, we also decide who we love. We don't just choose a person, we choose the kind of relationship we want to have. One that reaffirms our masks, or one that shatters them. The intelligent man Kierkegaard would have respected isn't the brightest, or the most well-read, or the most admired. He's the most honest with himself. And precisely because of that, he's also the most alone. Because while others still seek refuge in noise, he has chosen silence. And nothing is more uncomfortable for the sleeping soul than someone who has already awakened. Does that mean he's doomed to solitude? Not necessarily. But it does mean he can only deeply connect with someone who has also made her own inner journey. With someone who isn't afraid of her shadow. With someone who doesn't run from intensity, but knows how to hold it. And in a world addicted to the superficial, that is rare. Not impossible, but rare. Still, this kind of man doesn't become cynical. He doesn't lose faith. On the contrary, he waits. Not with anxiety, but with patience. Because he knows that what's real isn't found by desperately searching, but by being what you seek. And in his waiting, he becomes a lighthouse. Not for everyone, but for the one who's ready to stop pretending. Perhaps the greatest act of love he can offer is this: to show himself as he truly is, even if that provokes rejection. Because love cannot be born where there is deception. And clarity, though it may hurt, is the only fertile ground for real love. The fear his presence provokes, then, isn't a sign that there's something wrong with him. It's a sign that something is still asleep in others. And like anything that sleeps, it resists being awakened. But some, sooner or later, will open their eyes. And when they do, they might remember that gaze, not judging but not pleasing either. That gaze that asked for nothing, but offered everything. And then fear will turn into recognition. Because the soul, when it's ready, doesn't fear being seen. It seeks it, embraces it, honors it. And then there will be no need for words. Only shared truth. Sometimes, what scares us the most isn't the unknown, but the intensely familiar part of ourselves we've chosen to bury. That's why certain men can't be easily assimilated. Because beyond their words, their silence, their apparent calm, or their harmless gaze, there's something in them that shakes the foundation of our certainties. They don't come to confirm what we think we know about the world. They come to question it simply by existing. And that, whether we admit it or not, can feel like a threat. Not because they're aggressive, but because they are profoundly free. And what could be more unsettling to a domesticated soul than the radical freedom of another human being? Not the surface-level kind of freedom measured by external choices, career changes, or exotic travels, but the other kind. Quieter, deeper, noticeable in how they move through the world. In how they don't need validation. How they refuse to bargain with lies. How they don't pretend just to fit in. That kind of presence is a mirror. And we all know how painful it can be to look into a mirror that doesn't distort. One that doesn't decorate, doesn't soften, and doesn't lie. Because the true mirror doesn't show us what we wish to see. It shows us who we are when we think no one is watching. Kierkegaard spoke of the quiet despair in which most people live. A life that appears stable, functional, even happy, but is built on the avoidance of self. The intelligent man described in this reflection is not immune to that despair. He has felt it, moved through it, and exposed it. That's why, when he enters the life of someone still anesthetized, he isn't welcomed with open arms, but with a mix of attraction and rejection. Because his very presence reveals the possibility and the burden of awakening. But waking up hurts. And not everyone wants to feel that pain. Not yet. Not today. It's easier to stay on the surface. Where conversations don't go deep. Where connections don't demand truth. Where love looks more like an unspoken contract for comfort than a raw surrender of the self. In that superficial world, the lucid man becomes a foreigner. Not because he thinks he's better, but because he simply can't live any other way. And that difference, which he neither flaunts nor imposes, which he doesn't even feel the need to explain, becomes unbearable to those who still depend on the mask to survive. And so they call him distant, cold, arrogant, complicated, too much. But what they're really saying is, I'm not ready to look at what you've already seen. And he understands. He holds no resentment. He doesn't respond with contempt, because he knows, through his own experience, that everyone wakes up when they can and not before. That lucidity can't be forced. That the human soul needs time, silence, stumbles, and just the right amount of pain to finally desire the truth. And in this world where so many things can be obtained quickly, depth cannot be rushed. It can't be bought. It can't be faked. Depth, like real love, is cultivated. And it only blooms in those who have made room within themselves for what cannot be controlled, for what cannot be predicted, for what both hurts and redeems at the same time. That's why the intelligent man we've spoken of doesn't despair if he's misunderstood. His intelligence isn't in the service of seduction or recognition. It's in the service of his freedom. And that freedom comes at a price, misunderstanding. But it also brings a gift, peace. Because there's a kind of peace that doesn't depend on anything external, that can't be negotiated, that doesn't need approval. A peace that is born from having made peace with oneself, with one's own mistakes, one's own depths, with the impossibility of being loved by everyone. That peace is invisible, but it can be felt. It radiates. And it is, paradoxically, what attracts the most and what frightens the most. It attracts because it shows what is possible. And it frightens because it demands letting go of what's comfortable. He doesn't offer a promise of guaranteed happiness, but he offers something more valuable, the promise of authenticity. And that, as hard as it may be, is the only thing that can sustain a real bond over time. The women who have done their own inner work, who have faced their pain without seeking distractions, who no longer need to be admired in order to feel alive, these are the ones who can look at him without fear. Not because they have no wounds, but because they no longer fear showing them. Because they're not looking for a man to rescue them, but one who will walk beside them. Because they don't need to be lit up, they need to be seen. And when that encounter happens, when two human beings who have stopped running finally meet, there are no games, no strategies, no masks. There is only presence. And in that presence, something is born that doesn't need to be defined, because it can be felt, because it resonates, because it transforms. It's rare. It's scarce, but it's real. Perhaps that's why so many fear intelligent men in the way Kierkegaard understood them, because they don't just think clearly, they feel deeply. And in a society that has trained us to live on the surface, that is almost subversive, because true thought is not cold, nor abstract, nor elitist. It is an act of courage. It's the result of having sat with oneself through the darkest night, without turning off the light. And true feeling is not excess or drama. It is calm. It is full presence. It is attention with no agenda. That kind of man, who unites clarity and sensitivity, is an anomaly. Not because he's superior, but because he's stopped lying to himself. And that, in itself, makes him a beacon, an invitation, a reminder of what we could become if we stopped being so afraid. Maybe that's why, at the end of the day, the fear he stirs up isn't really about him. It's about ourselves, about everything we haven't allowed ourselves to feel, about everything we could be if we let the disguise fall away. And then maybe we can thank him, not for making us feel comfortable, but for making us think, for making us uncomfortable, for showing us there's another way to love, to see, to be, a way that doesn't need masks, a way that doesn't fear the abyss, a way that, though it may hurt, heals. And in that way, perhaps, we can finally meet. Not to complete each other, but to recognize one another. As we are. As we could be, if we stopped running.